The last stitch went through the ivory silk just as the candle beside Rosalind Vale guttered and died. She did not notice. Her fingers had memorized the rhythm 3 weeks ago on the first night she had sat in this chair with thread and needle and a hope that felt both fragile and inevitable. Pull, loop, secure. Tomorrow night she would wear this dress and everything would change, or she would discover that 3 weeks of belief stitched into silk had been nothing but beautiful lies. The silver blue embroidery caught what little moonlight came through the narrow window of her room, throwing patterns across the worn wooden floor like scattered stars. 23 years old, and this was the finest thing she had ever made with her own hands. Not the healing salves she prepared each morning in the small workroom behind Isolde's cottage. Not the poultices that eased fever, or the tinctures that calmed pain. Those were useful. Those saved lives. But this dress with its careful stitching and its whisper-thin fabric, this dress was different. This dress was an argument, a case she was making to the world, to herself, to Dorian Blackthorne, that she was worth more than the sum of her circumstances. The embroidery went along the neckline and down both sleeves in a pattern she had designed herself. Vines, small flowers, the kind that grew wild along the border territories where she had spent her entire life, where her mother had gathered them for healing work before illness had taken her 2 winters past. The thread was expensive. She had saved for it across 6 months, setting aside coins from the few patients who could afford to pay, saying no to herself each time she passed the market stall that sold honey cakes, denying herself small pleasures so that this one large pleasure could exist. Isolde had watched the dress take shape with the expression of a woman who has lived 50 years and learned that hope is both necessary and dangerous. She had said little. That was Isolde's way. She offered observations when asked, but she did not interfere. She had been her mother's closest friend, had stood beside her in the healing house when the fever had swept through the border territories 25 years ago and taken so many that the ground could not be dug fast enough. When Rosa's mother had died, Isolde had simply opened her door and said, "You will stay here now," and Rosa had stayed. 2 years of staying, 2 years of learning Isolde's methods, which were different from her mother's, but no less effective. 2 years of mornings that smelled of yarrow and evenings that tasted of chamomile tea. 2 years of a quiet life that felt like preparation for something. Though Rosa had not known what until Dorian Blackthorne had arrived at the border on pack business and seen her in the healing house and spoken to her as if she were someone worth speaking to. That had been 8 months ago. He had returned 4 times since then, each visit longer than the last, each conversation reaching deeper, touching on things that mattered. Her work, her hopes, the way she saw the world. On his last visit, he had taken her hand in the small garden behind Isolde's cottage and said the words that had made this dress necessary. "Come to Silver Peak Dominion for the gathering of the 12. I will present you before the assembled packs. I will make my intentions known." She had believed him because she wanted to believe, because believing felt like the only choice available to a woman whose entire life had been shaped by the accidents of birth and geography. She was nobody, the daughter of a healer. No pack name, no territorial standing, no bloodline that mattered to anyone except herself. But Dorian had looked at her as if she were somebody, and she had decided that being somebody was worth 3 weeks of candlelight and needle-pricked fingers. The dress was finished. Rosa set down her needle and thread with hands that trembled only slightly. She lifted the dress from the chair and held it up to the moonlight. The ivory silk moved like water. The silver blue embroidery glowed soft and certain. She had made this. With her own hands, with her own hope, with the strange and terrifying belief that tomorrow night, standing in the great hall of Silver Peak Dominion, she would finally step into the life she had been preparing for without knowing it. Isolde appeared in the doorway without sound. She had always moved like that, as if noise were optional, and she preferred to conserve it. Her eyes went to the dress first, then to Rosa's face. "It is beautiful," Isolde said. Soon. Her voice carried no emotion beyond fact. Rosa nodded. She could not speak yet. Her throat had closed around something too large to name. "Your mother would have been proud." That broke something open. Rosa felt tears rise and fought them back. Crying was not part of the plan. Crying was not how she wanted to begin tomorrow. She folded the dress carefully, laid it in the traveling chest that waited at the foot of her bed, and turned to face Isolde directly. "Do you think I am making a mistake?" Isolde considered this. She never answered quickly. She turned questions over in her mind, the way Rosa's mother used to turn herbs in her hands, examining them from all sides, checking for rot or weakness. "I think you are doing what you must do," Isolde said finally. "Whether it is a mistake depends on what you are hoping for. I am hoping for a life that is mine. Then it is not a mistake." Isolde stepped into the room, sat on the edge of Rosa's bed with the ease of a woman who had earned the right to be comfortable anywhere. But you must know that men make promises in small gardens that they do not always keep in great halls. Rosa knew. Of course she knew. She had watched enough people in her life, mended enough broken hearts alongside broken bones to understand that words were easier than actions. But knowing and accepting were different territories, and she was not ready to accept defeat before she had even entered the field. He will keep this promise, she said. She needed to say it aloud, needed to hear the words exist in the air between them. Isolde nodded slowly. Then we leave at dawn. Pack light. The journey is 2 days. Rosa did not sleep that night. She lay in bed with her eyes open, listening to the familiar sounds of Isolde's cottage. The creak of old wood settling, the whisper of wind through the eaves, the distant howl of border wolves running their territory. These were the sounds of her entire life. Tomorrow she would leave them behind. Tomorrow she would step into a different world, one where she did not know the sounds or the rhythms or the shape of her own place within it. But she would be wearing the dress, and that would have to be enough. The carriage that arrived at dawn was not elaborate, but it was solid, well made. Transportation that suggested careful planning and respect for its passengers. Isolde had arranged it through contacts. Rosa did not fully understand the network of healers and helpers that seemed to stretch across every territory, invisible to those who did not know how to look. Rosa placed her traveling chest inside with hands that no longer trembled. She had moved past nervousness into something calmer and more focused. This was happening. There was no space left for doubt. Isolde climbed in beside her without ceremony. She had packed her own small bag, had made arrangements for the patients who might need her during the 3 days they would be gone. Everything had been accounted for. Everything had been prepared. That was Isolde's gift, the ability to see what needed doing and to do it without fuss or drama. The carriage began to move. Rosa watched the border territories fall away behind her, the familiar landscape of scrub grass and twisted trees giving way to denser forest. The road was old, well-traveled, marked with the passage of countless wolves moving between territories for trade and treaty and the complicated business of pack politics. Isolde sat across from her, quiet, her hands folded in her lap. After an hour, she spoke. "You know what to expect at Silver Peak. Only what Dorian has told me." Rosa's voice sounded strange in the enclosed space of the carriage. Formal, careful. The gathering of the 12 happens once a season. All the major packs send representatives. There will be feasts and councils and ceremonies. And politics, Isolde added. More politics than you have ever seen in your life. These are not border healers and farmers, Rosa. These are alphas who control territories larger than you can imagine. They think in terms of alliances and bloodlines and power. You must be prepared for that. I am prepared. Isolde's expression suggested she was not convinced, but she said nothing more. The carriage rolled on. They stopped once to water the horses and eat the food Isolde had packed. Bread and cheese and dried fruit. Simple fare. Rosa ate without tasting. Her mind was already at Silver Peak, already walking into that great hall, already standing beside Dorian as he made his announcement before the assembled packs. The second day of travel brought them into different country. The trees grew taller here, older there, branches creating canopies that turned the sunlight green and gold. Rosa saw wolves running parallel to the road, at one point their forms flickering between the trees like shadows given substance. They did not approach. They were simply there watching, acknowledging the passage of the carriage through their territory. As evening approached on the second day, the forest opened up and Rosa saw Silver Peak Dominion for the first time. It was not a castle in the way stories describe castles. It was something older and stranger. A complex of buildings built from dark stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, walls that rose in irregular patterns, as if they had grown from the earth itself rather than been constructed on top of it. Towers at odd angles, courtyards visible through iron gates, and everywhere torches, hundreds of them, casting orange light that made the whole place feel alive and watchful. The carriage passed through the outer gates without challenge. Guards watched from their posts but did not stop them. Isolde had secured their entry through means Rosa did not question. They rolled through a courtyard where other carriages were arriving, where wolves in formal dress moved between buildings with the ease of those who belonged. When the carriage finally stopped, Rosa did not move immediately. She sat in the growing darkness and felt something shift inside her, recognition, as if she had been traveling toward this place her entire life and was only now arriving. Isolde touched her hand briefly. "Remember who you are, not who you hope to be. Who you are right now is enough," Rosa nodded. She stepped down from the carriage into the cool evening air of Silver Peak Dominion and felt the weight of watching eyes even though she could not see them. Somewhere in one of those dark stone buildings, Dorian was preparing for the feast. Somewhere in that maze of corridors and halls, her future was waiting to begin. She lifted her traveling chest herself, refusing the help of the servants who appeared at the carriage door. Isolde walked beside her as they were led through a side entrance down a corridor lit by torches set in iron brackets to a small room in the eastern wing. The room was narrow. The bed was hard. The fireplace smoked when the servant tried to light it, filling the space with a haze that made Rosa's eyes water. "This will do," Isolde said before Rosa could protest. "We are not here for comfort." The servant left. Rosa opened her traveling chest and lifted out the ivory dress. It had survived the journey without damage. The silver-blue embroidery caught the smoky torchlight and seemed to move with its own rhythm. Isolde helped her prepare. There was no ceremony to it, just the practical work of two women who understood that transformation required both patience and precision. Rosa bathed in the cold water provided, dressed slowly, carefully. Isolde braided her dark hair in a style that was both simple and elegant, weaving in a single silver ribbon that matched the embroidery. When Rosa finally stood before the small mirror in the corner of the room, she barely recognized herself. The dress fit as if it had been made by someone who understood her body better than she understood it herself. The embroidery drew the eye without demanding it. She looked like someone worth presenting, someone worth choosing. "Ready?" Isolde asked. Rosa took one breath, then another. Then she nodded. They left the narrow room and walked through the corridors of Silver Peak Dominion toward the Great Hall. The closer they came, the louder the sounds. Voices, laughter, the music of a large gathering in full celebration. Rosa's heart climbed into her throat and stayed there beating against her breath. Isolde stopped just outside the entrance to the Great Hall. She looked at Rosa with an expression that contained both pride and something darker, preparation for disappointment. "Whatever happens in there, you walk out of it with your head up. Do you understand me?" Rosa understood. But understanding and accepting were still different territories. She stepped through the entrance into the Great Hall, and her entire life pivoted on that single moment. The Great Hall of Silver Peak Dominion was larger than any space Rosa had ever occupied. The ceiling soared above her head, supported by columns carved with images of wolves in various states of transformation. Torches lined the walls in endless rows, their light turning the dark stone warm and alive. Long tables ran the length of the hall loaded with food that smelled of roasted meat and dark spices and wine that gleamed red in silver cups. But it was the people who took her breath. Wolves from 12 different territories, each one marked by the colors and symbols of their pack. Formal dress that ranged from simple elegance to elaborate display. Faces that carried the confidence of those who had never questioned their right to occupy space. The hall was full of voices of movement, of the complicated dance of pack politics playing out in real time. Rosa stood in the entrance with Isolde beside her and searched the crowd for Dorian's face. She found him near the center of the hall, standing with a group of wolves whose formal dress marked them as high-ranking. He wore dark gray that brought out the color of his eyes. He looked exactly as she remembered. Tall, well-made, a man who drew attention without seeming to ask for it. And beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, stood a woman who could only be nobility. She was tall, with dark hair that fell in perfect waves to her waist. Her dress was the color of deep burgundy, cut to flatter a figure that needed no flattering. She wore her beauty the way some people wore armor, with the confidence of someone who had always known exactly what power she possessed. She was looking up at Dorian with comfortable familiarity, and Dorian was looking back at her with something in his face that made Rosa's stomach drop. Isolde's hand found her elbow. "Steady." Rosa walked forward. She did not run, she did not flee. She walked with her shoulders back and her head up, the way her mother had taught her, the way Isolde had reminded her. Dignity was the only thing no one could take from you unless you gave it away freely. As she moved through the crowd, heads turned, she felt the weight of assessment in those glances, saw the questions forming. Who was she? Why was she here? What pack did she represent? She represented no one but herself, and that fact felt both liberating and terrifying. Dorian saw her, his eyes found her across the hall, and for a moment pain crossed his face. Then it was gone, replaced by the careful neutrality of a man who had made a decision and was preparing to defend it. He began to move toward her. The woman in burgundy moved with him, still holding his arm, her expression shifting from comfortable to curious. They met in the space between two tables where the crowd had thinned enough for privacy, but not enough for true solitude. Rosa stopped walking. She would not close the final distance. She would make him come to her. Dorian stopped 3 feet away. The woman beside him studied Rosa with sharp intelligence. Rosa. Dorian's voice was low, controlled, words chosen with care. She said nothing, just looked at him. Waited. I need to explain. No. The woman beside him said, her voice carrying unexpected warmth. I need to explain. She released Dorian's arm and took a step closer to Rosa. My name is Octavia Ravenscroft, and I believe we are both victims of the same man's inability to make difficult choices. Rosa looked at her, really looked, saw past the beauty to the intelligence beneath it, saw past the formal dress to the woman who wore it, and saw with a clarity that made her chest tighten that Octavia was not an enemy. He told you he was committed elsewhere, Rosa said. It was not a question. He told me you were informed, and accepting Octavia replied. He told me this match was political necessity and that you understood the situation. Rosa's eyes moved to Dorian. His face had gone carefully blank. I see. Octavia stepped closer still, her voice dropping so that only Rosa could hear. I do not know you, but I know what it costs to stand in this hall wearing hope like armor, and I am sorry that he chose to spend your hope without your permission. Pain bloomed in Rosa's chest. Not a break, a crack. The difference mattered. She looked at Dorian one more time, saw the man she had believed in standing there with his careful neutrality and his political calculations, saw the future she had stitched into ivory silk disappearing like smoke. I wish you both every happiness, she said. Her voice came out steady, stronger than she felt. Take care of yourself, Dorian. She turned before he could respond, before Octavia could say anything more, before the crack in her chest could spread into something that would show on her face. She walked toward the side exit of the great hall, with Isolde materializing beside her, a steady presence in peripheral vision. Behind her, she heard Dorian say something. The words did not reach her. She did not turn to catch them. She walked out of the great hall with her head up and her shoulders back because dignity was the only currency she had left, and she would not spend it on a man who had already spent hers. The corridor beyond the great hall was colder, darker. The torches here were spaced farther apart, leaving pools of shadow between islands of light. Rosa walked until she found an archway that opened onto an inner courtyard, and then she stopped. Isolde stood beside her in silence. After a moment, she spoke. He never deserved the dress. Rosa's laugh came out broken. I know. Do you? I do now. The courtyard was empty, small, paved with old stone that had been worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. A fountain stood in the center dry for the season, its basin filled with fallen leaves. Rosa looked at it and felt the weight that had been sitting in her chest since Dorian's face had appeared across the great hall finally begin to lift. She had come here hoping for one future and found instead that the future was not fixed. It was not decided. It was still being written, and she still held the pen. Isolde touched her shoulder briefly. What would you like to do? Rosa did not know. She had not planned past the moment of Dorian's announcement, had not considered what came after triumph, because she had been so certain triumph was the only option. Now she stood in a cold courtyard in a dress she had made with her own hands, and triumph felt like something that belonged to a different story entirely. It was then that she heard the footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, footsteps that changed the air before the person walking even appeared, as if the space itself knew in advance that something of weight was approaching and adjusted the temperature, the pressure, the silence accordingly. Rosa turned toward the corridor entrance. Isolde shifted slightly, moving into a protective position without seeming to move at all. 3 men appeared from the darkness of the corridor into the torchlight of the courtyard. They walked with the casual confidence of people who owned every space they entered, and they stopped a few paces from where Rosa and Isolde stood. The first was broad-shouldered with red-brown hair and a face that suggested he found most things mildly amusing. He wore dark green that marked him as part of one of the northern packs, though Rosa could not identify which one specifically. His eyes moved over her with open curiosity. The second was taller, sharp-featured, with a smile that lived permanently at the corner of his mouth. He wore black without decoration, and he carried himself like a man who had stopped caring what people thought of him somewhere around his 20th year and had never looked back. The third was the tallest of the three, and when Rosa's eyes found him, her chest did something she could not name. He wore black as well, but the fabric was different, richer, cut with precision that suggested either significant wealth or significant rank. His dark hair was pulled back from a face that was all angles and shadows, and his eyes were such a deep brown they looked black in the torchlight. He did not smile, did not perform interest or curiosity. He simply looked at her with complete focus, as if she were the only thing in the courtyard that mattered. Rosa felt his gaze like a physical thing, felt it move across her face, her dress, the embroidery on her sleeves, felt it settle somewhere near her eyes and stay there. The red-haired man spoke first, his voice carrying that same thread of amusement that lived in his expression. You came from the direction of the Great Hall. It was not a question, but Rosa answered anyway. Yes. And you are standing in a cold courtyard instead of enjoying the feast. The sharp-featured man's smile deepened. That usually means someone did something unfortunate. Isolde drew a slow breath beside her. Rosa felt the warning in it. These were not ordinary wolves. These were people who mattered, and engaging with them might have consequences neither of them had planned for. But Rosa was tired of planning, tired of hope, tired of measuring her words against possible futures. Do you always question women in courtyards, she asked, or only when the feast grows boring? The red-haired man laughed. A genuine sound. Delighted. The sharp-featured one raised an eyebrow with clear interest. The third man, the tall one whose eyes had not left her face, finally moved. One step forward, and when he did, the air in the courtyard changed, thickened, the way it does before a storm when pressure builds and animals go quiet. Rosa felt something ancient inside her go completely still. He spoke and his voice was low controlled, carrying weight that belonged to someone who had never needed to raise it to be heard. What is your name? The courtyard went silent. Even Isolde stopped breathing for a moment. Rosa looked at him directly, felt with a clarity she could not explain, and had not asked for that this question was not casual, that this man did not ask casual questions, that when he wanted to know something, it was because he had already decided the answer mattered. Rosalind. She said her full name, not the shortened version Isolde used. Rosalind Vale, from the border territories. His expression shifted too quickly to name. Then it was gone. I know every territory, he said, and there was something in those words that sounded less like arrogance and more like simple fact. None of them would do you justice. The red-haired man made a sound that might have been a cough and might have been a suppressed laugh. The sharp-featured one looked at the sky with the serene expression of someone pretending to be somewhere else entirely. Rosa held the tall man's gaze and felt the ground shift beneath her feet. The red-haired man introduced himself as Alaric. He did it the way he seemed to do most things, without waiting for an invitation, with a slight grin that suggested he found the entire universe mildly entertaining and saw no reason to hide that fact. The sharp-featured one was Bastion. He offered his name with a small incline of his head that was almost a bow, but stopped just short, as if full formality was something he had decided long ago was beneath him. The third man offered nothing beyond what he had already given. He stood slightly apart from the other two, not physically distant, but separated by something less tangible. A quality of stillness that made the space around him feel different from the space around everyone else. His eyes had moved from Rosa's face only once briefly when Alaric had spoken. Then they had returned to her with the patience of someone who was not in a hurry and had no intention of pretending otherwise. We should return inside, Isolde said quietly. Her voice carried the careful tone of someone trying to sound casual and not quite succeeding. You are welcome to, Bastion said pleasantly, though I would argue the courtyard has become considerably more interesting than the feast. Isolde looked at Rosa. Rosa looked at the tall man whose name she still did not know. He was still looking at her. The man from the Northern Territories, he said. It was not phrased as a question, but it functioned as one. Rosa felt the words land in the center of her chest, where the humiliation from earlier was still sitting like heat she had not yet decided what to do with. That is not your concern, she said. Kept her voice even. No, he agreed. Then after a pause that felt deliberately placed, but it will be. Alaric made a sound that was definitely a suppressed laugh this time. Bastion looked at the fountain with profound interest. Rosa squared her shoulders. I do not know who you are. His expression shifted. Not quite a smile, something in the same neighborhood but with different furniture. You know who I am, he said. There was no arrogance in it, just the simple recognition of a fact. I know the title, Rosa said. I do not know you. That he said is the first honest thing anyone has said to me in this court tonight. The air between them shifted. Rosa felt it the way she felt weather changes. Pressure dropping, temperature rising. The electricity that comes before lightning. The feast will continue for several more hours, the tall man said. The formal edge returned to his tone, but it felt like a door being held open rather than closed. You should not spend them in a cold courtyard. I was leaving, Rosa said. I know. His eyes moved briefly to the embroidery on her sleeve. The silver-blue thread caught the torchlight and glowed for a second, and his attention sharpened in a way she felt rather than saw. Stay. It was a single word, not a command, though it could have been one from a man who clearly held authority. It was something closer to a request delivered by someone who was not accustomed to making requests and was doing it anyway carefully as if the word itself was unfamiliar in his mouth. Rosa should have said no. She had a very clear list of reasons to say no, beginning with the obvious fact that she had just been publicly set aside by a man she had trusted, and ending with the equally obvious fact that accepting invitations from strange men in cold courtyards was not how well-thought-out decisions began. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said 1 hour. Alaric straightened from where he had been leaning against the courtyard wall with an expression of deep satisfaction. Excellent. The great hall looked different the second time Rosa entered it. Or perhaps she was the one who was different. She walked in beside Isolde, with the tall man slightly behind and to her left, and Alaric and Bastian forming a loose perimeter that was casual enough to not look deliberate and structured enough that every wolf in the room with any instinct at all would understand exactly what it meant, which was all of them. Every head that turned as they crossed the threshold was turning, because every wolf in that hall could feel the shift in the air, the gravity that followed certain people when they moved through a room. And he was moving through it, toward a table near the center, toward her. Rosa kept her eyes forward and her expression neutral and told herself very firmly that her heart was beating at a perfectly normal pace. Across the hall, she saw Dorian. He had noticed. Of course he had. His eyes found her through the crowd, and the expression on his face was genuine confusion, unguarded, as if the scene in front of him did not compute, as if the version of Rosa he had constructed in his mind did not include this possibility. Octavia was saying something to him. He was not listening. Rosa looked away, found herself being guided to a chair at a table that had somehow cleared space for her arrival. A cup of wine appeared in front of her with the silent efficiency of staff who understood which guest required immediate attention. Isolde sat beside her and leaned close enough to murmur, "I need you to explain what is happening." "I genuinely cannot," Rosa murmured back. The tall man sat across from her, not beside her, which she noticed. Across where he could see her face, which she also noticed, and then immediately told herself she was reading too much into seating arrangements. "You are from the border territories," he said. "Not a question. My mother was a healer for the eastern borderlands. She died 2 winters ago. And your father before her, and when I was young enough that I do not remember his face." He absorbed this without visible reaction, which was somehow less cold than it might have been, and more like the response of someone who understood that certain information deserves to be received without performance. "You made the dress yourself," he said. Rosa looked up. "How do you know that the stitching on the left sleeve is slightly tighter than the right?" His eyes moved to the sleeve briefly, then back to her face. Someone sewing for themselves pulls differently on their dominant side. It is not a flaw. It is a signature. The table around them was not entirely quiet. Alaric was already deep in conversation with someone from a neighboring pack, his laugh carrying easily over the general noise. Bastian was eating with the focused appreciation of a man who had strong opinions about food and was pleased with the current selection. But the small radius between Rosa and the tall man had a different quality to it. Quieter. More deliberate. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. He looked at her steadily. "Doing what this?" She gestured slightly at the space between them. "You do not know me. An hour ago I was no one in a corridor." "An hour ago," he said, his voice dropping but just enough that the words were for her and no one else. "You walked out of a hall where someone had just humiliated you, and you did it with your head up and your shoulders back and your voice completely steady." He paused. "I have sat in that hall for 12 years. I have watched wolves with armies behind them fold under far less." Rosa held his gaze, said nothing. "You asked why," he said. "That is why." Across the hall, Dorian was still watching, but Rosa had stopped looking in that direction entirely. The feast lasted well past midnight. Rosa had not intended to stay that long. She had said 1 hour and meant it, had fully planned to rise from the table at the appropriate moment, collect Isolde, and return to the narrow room in the eastern wing where the fireplace smoked and no one came to refill your cup unless you went looking for them. She stayed 3 hours, not because she was persuaded, not because anyone asked her to remain past the hour she had agreed to. She stayed because the conversation moved the way certain rivers move without obvious effort, finding the natural course of things. And by the time she noticed how much time had passed, the candles on the table had burned down considerably, and Isolde had fallen asleep sitting upright against the wall behind her with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to waiting. The tall man did not speak constantly, That was what she noticed first, and then kept noticing, because it was unusual in her experience of men who held power. One of them filled silence the way they filled rooms with presence and noise, and the energy of someone performing their own importance. He did not perform. He asked questions and then listened to the answers with the complete attention of someone who had asked because he genuinely wanted to know. And he offered his own words carefully, as if he had thought about them before releasing them. He told her about Silver Peak, not its history or its politics, but small things. The way the stone of the eastern tower changed color in winter, going from black to something closer to gray-blue when the frost settled in. The silence in the great library on the upper floor, which he visited almost every night when the court was asleep. The fact that the cook, a woman named Berta, who had worked the kitchens for 30 years, made a specific bread with rosemary and sea salt that was available only on feast nights, and that he had learned long ago to secure a portion early in the evening because it disappeared within the first hour without exception. Rosa found herself talking in return. Not about Dorian, not about the corridor or the dress or the heat still sitting in her chest. About other things, about her mother in the border territory. The way the frass sounded at the edge of the eastern lands in early morning. The gray light that came through the trees before sunrise when the mist was heavy and the world smelled of pine and cold earth and everything was very still. About the 3 seasons she had spent working in the healing house, learning to identify plants and prepare remedies, because it was useful and because it gave her hands something to do, and because Isolde had told her she had good instincts for it. Healing, he said, with attention that meant he was cataloging the information rather than simply receiving it. Basic healing, she corrected. I am not trained, I just learned what I could. Isolde of the eastern borderlands, he said. She trained under the last court healer of Silver Peak before he died. She knows more than most formally trained healers in 3 territories. Rosa looked at him. How do you know that if she taught you, he said simply, you are not as untrained as you believe. It was not flattery. It was delivered with the same tone he used for everything else. Level, direct, as if he were stating a simple fact rather than a kindness, which somehow made it land differently than flattery would have. Alaric dropped back into the seat beside the tall man at some point past the second hour, returning from whatever conversation had occupied him across the hall, with the satisfied expression of someone who had successfully extracted useful information from multiple sources. The Blackthorn delegation is leaving early, he said, helping himself to wine without ceremony. Tomorrow morning. Apparently there was some internal disagreement about the alliance announcement. He said this to the tall man, but his eyes moved briefly to Rosa with an expression that was not unkind. That has nothing to do with me, Rosa said. Of course not. Alaric agreed pleasantly, just making conversation. Bastian reappeared to Rosa's left and set a small plate in front of her without explanation. On it was a portion of bread golden and fragrant with visible rosemary pressed into the crust. Berta's rosemary bread, he said. Last piece, I had to negotiate for it. You stole it, Alaric said. I negotiated, Bastian repeated with dignity. Rosa looked down at the bread and felt the tight outer layer that had been holding since the corridor finally began to loosen. She broke off a piece. It was warm and slightly salty, and the rosemary was exactly right. She thought very firmly about nothing in particular for a moment. When she looked up, the tall man was watching her with that same expression she had first seen in the corridor. Recognition, the certainty of someone confirming a thing they had already decided was true. What she said. Nothing, he said. It was late when she finally rose from the table. Late enough that the hall had thinned considerably, leaving only those wolves who had nowhere else to be or who were too deep in conversation to notice the hour. Your quarters are in the eastern wing, the tall man said as she stood. It was not a question. He knew. They will be moved tomorrow. Rosa looked at him. To where somewhere warmer, with a fireplace that works. It was such a specific and practical thing to say that it caught her completely unprepared. She laughed, a short, genuine sound that surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise him. His face changed when she laughed. Very slightly, like a room that has been closed for a long time and someone has opened a window in it. Good night, he said. And then after a pause, Rosalind Vale from the border territories. Good night, she said. And then because it seemed only fair, what is your name? Alaric made a sound that might have been choking. Bastian suddenly found the ceiling extremely interesting. Cassian, the tall man said, Cassian Devereaux. He did not offer a title, did not explain, just gave her the name as if it were the only thing that mattered. Good night, Cassian Devereaux, Rosa said. She turned and walked toward the corridor with Isolde beside her, newly awakened and moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who had not actually been asleep at all. And she did not look back, and the heat in her chest had changed into something she did not yet have a name for, but that burned considerably warmer. Behind her, she heard Alaric say quietly and with great satisfaction, "Well," and heard Cassian say nothing at all, which she was beginning to learn was how he said the most important things. The new quarters were in the southern tower. Rosa discovered this the following morning when a knock came at the door of the narrow eastern wing room before sunrise. A woman stood in the corridor, middle-aged and efficient-looking, who introduced herself as Petra and began folding Rosa's things into her traveling chest with the brisk competence of someone who had been given a task and intended to complete it before breakfast. "This is unnecessary," Rosa said, sitting up in bed, with her hair loose and her dignity only partially assembled. "The Alpha King's orders," Petra said pleasantly, and continued folding. Isolde in the adjacent cot watched this from under her blanket with an expression of profound interest and said nothing, which was loudly communicative in its own right. The southern tower room was not large, but it was entirely different in quality from everything in the eastern wing. The stone walls were hung with tapestries in deep green and silver, depicting forests and running wolves in the landscape that suggested old power and deep territory. The fireplace worked. There was a window seat with an actual cushion, and the window itself looked out over an inner courtyard where the morning light came in at an angle that turned the frost on the stone into silver. Rosa stood in the middle of it for a moment after Petra left with Isolde beside her, and neither of them said anything for a few seconds. Then Isolde said, "The Alpha King moved your room." "I know, because your fireplace smoked." "That is what he said." "Rosalind, I know," Rosa said again, more quietly. She knew. She was not a woman who misread things. Or at least she had believed she was not before Dorian, before the dress, before 3 weeks of candlelight stitching that had ended in a cold corridor. She was trying to be careful with what she allowed herself to understand, trying to hold the information loosely without weight, without hope's gravity, which she had recently learned was heavier than it appeared. But the room was warm, and the window light was silver. And something about both of those things made careful very difficult. She saw Dorian once more before his delegation left. It was not planned. She was crossing the inner courtyard in mid-morning, having found that the southern tower had its own access to the outside, and that the courtyard was mostly quiet at that hour. She had wanted 10 minutes of sky in the silence of a space that had no social requirements. Dorian was crossing from the opposite direction, clearly heading toward the main gate where his delegation's carriages were being prepared. They saw each other at the same moment. He stopped. She did not. She kept her pace even and her direction unchanged because the courtyard was wide enough that their paths would not intersect unless one of them altered course, and she had no intention of altering course. "Rosalind," he said her full name from a few meters away, with the tone of someone who had prepared something to say and was uncertain whether the moment had arrived. She stopped. Not because she owed him the stop, because she was 23 years old and she had spent a long time being the person who kept walking and swallowed things down and moved on before she was ready. And she was finding that she was no longer interested in that habit. She turned to face him. He looked like someone who had spent the night revising a version of events. There were shadows under his eyes and his jaw was set in the way of someone holding something tense. "What happened last night?" he began. "Was your choice," she said. "I know, I did not expect." He stopped. Started again. "I did not know you knew anyone at court. I did not know you had connections here." Rosa looked at him for a moment. "I did not. I do not. I know a quarter in a cold hour and someone who asked my name." Pain moved through his expression. She recognized it because she had felt a version of it herself. The discomfort of understanding that a calculation you made was wrong, that you misjudged something in a direction you cannot now correct. "The alliance with the Ravenscroft family is important," he said. "It matters for my pack." "It was never about you, Dorian," she said his name quietly without heat. "I hope the alliance serves your pack well." "I genuinely do." She meant it. That was the part that surprised her slightly. How completely she meant it. The heat that had sat in her chest since the night before had burned through something in the night, and what remained was not bitterness. It was something cleaner, the relief of a weight being set down. She turned and continued across the courtyard, did not look back. This time it required no effort at all. The formal court assembly convened at midday. Rosa had not been required to attend. She was a guest of no particular rank, with no pack representation and no official standing in the assembly of alphas and their delegates that gathered in the Great Hall to address territorial matters and court business. She had fully intended to spend the assembly in the southern tower with the window seat and the silver light in a volume she had borrowed from a shelf near the fireplace. She attended because Petra appeared at her door 1 hour before it began and laid out a dress. Not the ivory dress with the silver blue embroidery, a different one. Deep blue, the color of the sky in the last moment before full dark, with silver thread along the collar and cuffs that caught light the way water catches it. Moving and alive. It was clearly made by someone who knew what they were doing and had access to materials that cost more than Rosa had ever spent on anything in her life. "I cannot wear this," Rosa said. "The Alpha King's orders," Petra said, and smoothed the skirt with one hand in a way that suggested the conversation was finished. Isolde from the window seat made a sound that was not quite a laugh and was entirely too knowing. The assembly hall was arranged differently from the banquet configuration. The long tables had been cleared and replaced with a semicircular arrangement of heavy chairs, each bearing the crest of a pack positioned to face the central platform where a single chair sat. Not quite a throne, but functioning as one. The Alphas and their senior wolves were already seated when Rosa entered with Petra, who guided her with quiet efficiency to a position along the side wall. A reserved section that was not the floor, but was not exactly the gallery either. A middle space, visible but not central. Octavia Ravenscroft sat in her packed section with her father, whose eyes found Rosa with an expression of assessment that had nothing warm in it initially, then shifted to something closer to respect. Alaric was positioned near the platform. He caught her eye and offered a slight nod that communicated something between acknowledgement and encouragement. Then Cassian entered. He came through the main doors at the far end of the hall with two senior wolves flanking him, wearing no ceremonial decoration beyond the black cloak and the single silver clasp at the throat that she was already beginning to recognize as his customary mark. The room changed when he entered it. Not loudly, not through any dramatic shift in sound or movement, but every wolf in that assembly straightened fractionally, oriented fractionally. The involuntary responsive bodies that understood below the level of thought what authority had entered the room. He crossed to the platform and took a seat without ceremony, and then before the assembly formally opened his eyes, moved across the room once. A single slow sweep, and stopped on her. He held her gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Not long, but deliberate. 3 seconds that were not incidental. That had been decided upon before the moment arrived. Then he looked forward and the assembly began. Rosa realized she had been holding her breath and quietly released it. Beside her, a woman she did not know leaned slightly closer and murmured, "He has never looked at the side gallery during an opening. Not once in 12 years. Rosa said nothing, but she felt the warmth of the southern tower room settle again into her chest and understood that whatever she was trying to hold loosely was becoming heavier by the hour. The assembly addressed territorial boundaries, resource agreements between the northern packs, a formal recognition of a new alpha in the Western March territory. Rosa paid attention to all of it because the world it revealed was one she had only known from the outside, and she found it more intricate and more human than the distance had suggested. She was still watching when the final item was raised. It was Octavia's father who raised it, Alpha Ravenscroft, a broad man with silver at his temples and the confidence of someone who had never needed to question his own standing. He rose from his seat with the ease of a man accustomed to the floor. "There is a matter of succession," he said, his voice carried to every corner of the hall without effort. "The court has been patient. The Eastern Pacts have made their inquiries through formal channels. We would ask with respect that the Alpha King address the question of a mate and an heir before the next seasonal assembly." The room was very still. Cassian looked at Alpha Ravenscroft with an expression that was entirely unreadable. "The matter," Cassian said, his voice carrying the same effortless weight, "is already being addressed." Ravenscroft paused. By what means? Cassian's eyes moved across the room again. And this time they did not stop at 3 seconds. They stopped on Rosa and stayed. The entire assembly turned to follow his gaze. The silence that followed had texture and weight, the silence of an entire room, revising what it thought it understood. Rosa sat very straight in the deep blue dress with the silver thread catching the torchlight, and she did not look away from him, because she was 23 years old and had spent enough of her life looking away, and she had decided somewhere between the courtyard and the corridor and the silver window light of a room with a fireplace that worked that she was finished with that habit. The assembly did not immediately dissolve into chaos, but it came close. Alpha Ravenscroft remained standing for several seconds after Cassian's gaze had made its meaning clear, with the expression of a man whose prepared speech had been rendered entirely irrelevant, and who was deciding in real time how to respond to that. Around the semicircle, wolves shifted in their seats with the contained energy of a room full of people who had strong reactions in the political sense to keep them internal. At least temporarily. Cassian rose from his chair. The room quieted immediately. A room's quiet when the person standing does not need to ask for silence. The assembly is concluded, he said. Senior delegates will remain for private counsel. All others are dismissed. It was not a request. The hall began to clear with the orderly efficiency of wolves who understood a direct command. Rosa rose with the general movement, uncertain whether she was included in the dismissal or the remaining. Petra materialized beside her with the quiet purposefulness that was apparently the woman's defining characteristic. You will stay. Rosa stayed. When the hall had emptied to the senior delegates, perhaps 15 wolves in total, and the doors had been drawn closed, the quality of the room changed entirely. The formality lifted the way weather lifts after rain, and what remained was something more direct and considerably less comfortable for several of those present. Alpha Ravenscroft spoke first. My lord, his tone was measured, but the measure was an effort. With respect, the woman is unknown to this court. She carries no pack, no rank, no territorial standing. The question of succession requires the question of succession, Cassian said, and his voice had not changed in volume, but had changed in weight. Dropping into a register that made the stone walls seem to pay attention, has been raised by this court for 12 years. I have heard it for 12 years. Tonight I am answering it. You are answering it with someone no one has heard of, Ravenscroft said. His control was good, but not perfect. The Eastern Pax will accept what the Alpha King decides, Alaric said pleasantly from his position near the wall. That is in fact the foundational principle of this entire assembly. Ravenscroft looked at Alaric with an expression that suggested he found him deeply unhelpful. I am not asking the Eastern Pax to accept anything tonight, Cassian said, with the quiet finality of someone who had already decided how this ended and was being patient with the process of others arriving at the same conclusion. I am informing this council of my intention. The formal process will follow in the appropriate order. He looked at Rosa then, directly across the half-empty hall, and the look said, Come here. Not a command, the same thing he had done in the corridor the night before with the word stay. A request delivered by someone who was not accustomed to making them and was doing it anyway, carefully, as if he was still learning the shape of the gesture. Rosa walked forward. Every eye in the room followed hers. Octavia's gaze had a quality she could feel without looking directly at it, the focused attention of someone watching something unfold that they had not expected. She walked until she was a few paces from Cassian and stopped. Up close in the full light of the assembly hall, rather than torchlight or quarter shadow, he was more present than she had processed from a distance. The dark eyes were steady on her face with the same expression she had cataloged since the first moment in the corridor. Recognition, certainty, relief, a man who has been looking for something without knowing he was looking and has found it. I should have asked you first, he said quietly, for her alone before the assembly. I should have asked. Rosa held his gaze. Yes, you should have. His expression shifted. Not quite a smile, the same not quite smile she had seen before, but it reached his eyes this time in a way it had not previously, and it changed his face in a way that made him look briefly like someone younger and considerably less armored. I am asking now, he said, whatever this becomes, whatever the process requires, I am asking if you are willing. The hall was silent enough that the torches were audible. Rosa thought about the carriage and the iron gates and the dress she had sewn by candlelight. She thought about the corridor and the cold, and her own shoulders held deliberately back. She thought about the silver window light and the fireplace that worked. She thought about 3 seconds of held gaze across an assembly hall and a man who apparently had not looked at the side gallery in 12 years. She thought about her mother who had told her once in the quiet of a winter morning that the most important things in a life are the ones that ask for you specifically. Not for a role you fill or a use you serve. For you, I am willing, she said. Alpha Ravenscroft opened his mouth, closed it. Octavia was looking at Rosa with an expression that had shifted entirely from assessment to what looked unexpectedly like approval. There will be conditions, an elder from the Northern Territories said. His voice was reedy with age but carried weight. A courtship period, 3 months, to allow the court to know her, to allow her to understand what she is accepting. That is acceptable, Cassian said. He had not looked away from Rosa. She will need to prove herself, another elder added, not through bloodline, through service. Also acceptable, Cassian said. And if she cannot, Ravenscroft said not unkindly, then we revisit this conversation in 3 months. We will not need to revisit it, Cassian said. There was no arrogance in it, just certainty. Isolde, who had been standing in the shadows near the side wall, stepped forward. Her movement was small but deliberate, and every eye turned to her. "If I may," she said. Her voice was calm, practiced. The voice of a woman who had spent 50 years speaking truth in rooms that did not always want to hear it. Cassian nodded. Rosalind's mother was a healer of some renown in the eastern borderlands. 25 years ago, when the fever swept through 3 territories and took thousands, she worked without rest for 6 weeks. She saved more lives than can be counted. The court healer at that time wrote of her work, called her the Silver Hand, said she had a gift that went beyond training. Isolde paused. Healers are valued in our culture, perhaps more than warriors, perhaps more than wealth. If this court wants proof of worth, look to the work, look to the legacy. Rosalind carries that in her hands. The room was quiet for a long moment. Then Octavia spoke. She did not stand, did not make a performance of it, just spoke from her seat with the clear confidence of someone who had decided something and was sharing that decision. "I was chosen for alliance," she said. "She was chosen for something else. The kingdom needs both. But if we must choose between politics and what the king actually wants, I would argue we choose the latter. We have had 12 years of politics. Perhaps it is time for something different." Alpha Ravenscroft looked at his daughter with an expression that was equal parts surprise and respect. Then he looked at Rosa, then at Cassian. 3 months, he said. Prove she belongs here. Prove she can serve this court. And we will support the bond. Cassian inclined his head. Agreed. The assembly dissolved after that. Not formally, just through the natural process of wolves deciding the important business was concluded, and the rest was detail. Rosa found herself standing in the center of a slowly emptying hall, with Cassian still in front of her, and Isolde appearing at her elbow like a quiet anchor. 3 months, Isolde said. 3 months, Rosa agreed. Cassian looked at her with that same steady gaze that had not wavered since the courtyard. Are you certain she was not? Not entirely, but certainty was not the same as willingness, and willingness was what he had asked for. I am willing, she said again. Then that is enough, he said. And for the first time since she had sewn the last stitch into the ivory dress, Rosa believed that perhaps it was. Disclaimer. This story contains a fictional plague scenario set in a fantasy world. The healing methods described are fictional and should not be considered medical advice. The 3 months began the morning after the assembly, with Rosa standing in the southern tower room, watching dawn break over Silver Peak Dominion, and understanding that she had agreed to something both simpler and more complicated than she had initially realized. Simpler because the terms were clear. 3 months to prove she could serve this court. 3 months to show she belonged in a world she had only ever seen from the outside. More complicated because proving and belonging were not the same thing, and she was not entirely certain which one mattered more. Isolde appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of tea and the expression of a woman who had been awake for hours and had already made several decisions about how the day would proceed. We start with the healing house, she said. No preamble, no good morning, just a statement of fact and the expectation that Rosa would follow. There is no healing house, Rosa said. There will be by sunset. Isolde set 1 cup on the windowsill and kept the other. She had that look she got when she had decided something needed doing and was not interested in discussing whether it was possible. It was the same look she had worn when she had appeared at Rosa's mother's funeral and announced that Rosa would be coming to live with her, and anyone who objected could take it up with the winter winds. The old court healer's workroom is still standing. Isolde continued. It has been locked for 5 years, unused, wasted. Petra has already secured the keys. Rosa looked at her. You have been planning this. Since the moment Cassian Devereaux looked at you in that corridor, and I saw his face change, Isolde said. I have lived 50 years, child. I know what it looks like when someone recognizes something they did not know they were searching for. And I know what it takes to build a foundation under a moment like that before it collapses from its own weight. She drank her tea, set the cup down with the finality of a closing argument. So we build, and we build fast. The old court healer's workroom occupied a corner of the southern wing that faced the healing gardens. Those gardens had once been maintained with the care of something sacred, but 5 years of neglect had turned them wild. Useful plants still grew there, but they grew alongside weeds and thorns, and the chaos that comes when human intention withdraws and nature fills the vacuum. Rosa stood in the doorway of the workroom and felt her chest expand. The room was larger than she had expected. Stone walls, high windows that let in northern light, shelves that ran floor to ceiling empty now, but clearly built to hold supplies. A long wooden table in the center scarred with use but solid, a fireplace large enough to heat water and prepare tinctures. Everything a healer could need waiting in dust and silence for someone to bring it back to life. Isolde appeared beside her with the broom. "The garden first," she said. "We cannot make medicine from chaos." They worked through that first day without stopping. Rosa in the garden identifying what could be saved and what needed clearing. Isolde in the workroom scrubbing shelves and sweeping floors and muttering under her breath about the criminal waste of leaving good space empty. Petra brought them food at midday and stayed to help. She had a practical intelligence that needed no explanation, understanding immediately what Rosa was trying to do and moving to support it without being asked. By evening, the garden had begun to show its bones again. The useful plants separated from the chaos, paths cleared between the beds. Rosa's hands were filthy and her back ached, and she felt more alive than she had since the night she had finished sewing the ivory dress. Cassian found her there as the sun was setting. She did not hear him approach. He moved with the quiet of someone who had spent a lifetime learning not to announce himself unless he chose to. "You have been working all day," he said. Rosa straightened from where she had been kneeling in the dirt, looked at him. He was still in the formal clothes from whatever court business had occupied his day, but he had removed the cloak and his sleeves were rolled to his elbows. "I have 3 months," she said. "I cannot waste time. This is not waste. It is not proof either. Not yet." He stepped into the garden, looked around with the focused attention she was beginning to recognize as his default state, missing nothing, cataloging everything. "The court has not had a functioning healing house in 5 years," he said. "If you manage to restore this in 3 months, that alone would be proof." Rosa shook her head. "Restoring a room is not the same as serving a people." "No," he agreed, "but it is a beginning." He moved closer, close enough that she could see the dust on his boots from whatever roads he had traveled that day, close enough that she could smell the scent that followed him, cedar and earth after rain. "What do you need?" he asked. The question was so direct, so practical, that it caught her off guard. "Supplies," she said. "Dried herbs I cannot grow in time. Glass bottles for tinctures, clean cloth for bandages. A budget for the things I cannot make myself. Done. Just like that. Just like that." "Why, because you asked," he said. "And because this court has needed a healer for longer than I have been willing to admit." He turned to leave, stopped, looked back at her with that expression that had become familiar in the days since the corridor. Recognition and certainty, and something else she could not name. "You are already proving yourself, Rosalind. The court just needs time to see what I saw the moment you walked out of that hall with your head up." He left before she could respond. Rosa stood in the healing garden with dirt under her fingernails and felt the warmth of being seen settle somewhere near her heart. The 3 months unfolded in a rhythm that became its own kind of meditation. Mornings in the healing garden, learning which plants thrived in Silver Peak soil and light, teaching Petra and 2 young women from the court staff who had expressed interest in learning the craft. Afternoons in the workroom, preparing tinctures and salves, building inventory, creating the systems that would allow the healing house to function not just for a season but for years. Evenings varied. Sometimes Rosa took her meals in the southern tower with Isolde, reviewing the day's work and planning the next. Sometimes she was invited to dine in the smaller hall, where the senior court members gathered, and she learned to navigate the complicated social dynamics of wolves who held power and the alliances that sustained them. And sometimes Cassian appeared in the healing garden just as the light was fading and asked if she would walk with him. Those walks became the axis around which everything else turned. He did not talk constantly. That was still his way. But he talked more than he had in the beginning. Told her about the weight of ruling 12 territories, the constant negotiation between what he wanted and what the kingdom needed, the loneliness of making decisions that affected thousands while having very few people he could trust, with the uncertainty that preceded those decisions. He was 35, he told her one evening, had been Alpha King for 12 years, had watched wolves his own age settle into mateship and parenthood while he waited for something he could not name until he saw her walk out of a great hall with her shoulders back. Rosa told him about her mother, the way she had worked, the patience required to wait for a fever to break or a wound to close, the helplessness of knowing all the remedies in the world could not save everyone and the necessity of trying anyway. They did not touch, not beyond the occasional brush of hands when he helped her over rough ground or she steadied herself on his arm. But the space between them felt increasingly like something that mattered, something being built with the same care she was bringing to the healing house. 2 months into the 3, Octavia Ravenscroft came to visit the healing garden. She arrived without announcement, dressed simply, with none of the formal elegance Rosa had first seen in the Great Hall. She stood at the garden entrance and waited to be acknowledged, which was its own courtesy. Rosa straightened from the bed she had been weeding, wiped her hands on her apron. "Lady Ravenscroft," she said, "just Octavia, please. The formal titles make me feel like my mother, and I am trying very hard not to become her." Rosa almost smiled. "Come in." Octavia moved through the garden with careful attention. She asked questions about the plants, about the process of making tinctures, about how Rosa had learned what she knew. They talked for an hour, and somewhere in that hour Rosa understood that Octavia had not come for information. She had come for something else entirely. "I owe you an apology," Octavia said finally. They were sitting on the stone bench near the center of the garden, the one that caught the afternoon sun. "You owe me nothing," Rosa said. "I was prepared to dislike you." Octavia's voice was steady, matter of fact. "When I saw you in that corridor wearing that dress, I thought, here is another woman who thinks beauty is enough, who thinks a pretty face will unlock doors that should require more." She paused. "I was wrong, and I am sorry for judging you before I knew you." Rosa looked at her, really looked, saw past the perfect features to the intelligence and the loneliness and the strength it took to admit being wrong. "You were not entirely wrong," Rosa said. "I did think the dress would be enough. I spent 3 weeks believing that if I could just make myself beautiful enough, worthy enough, visible enough, then I would finally really matter to someone who mattered. And now I know the dress was never for him. It was for me. Proof that I could make something beautiful with my own hands, that I could transform hope into something tangible." Octavia was quiet for a moment. Then she smiled, a real smile. Not the polite performance Rosa had seen in the Great Hall, but something genuine and warm. "I think we are going to be friends," she said. "I think we already are," Rosa replied. And she meant it. 2.5 months into the 3 word came from the eastern borderlands. Plague. Not the fever that had killed Rosa's mother. Something different. Faster. More aggressive. It had appeared in 3 border villages within the span of a week, and the reports said it was spreading. The court council convened that evening. Rosa was not invited to attend, but she heard about it afterward from Petra, who had sources in every corner of Silver Peak and a gift for extracting information. "The council wants to establish a quarantine," Petra said. "Lock down the border territories. Let the plague burn itself out." "How many people live in those territories?" Rosa asked. "Thousands. And if they lock it down," Petra's face said everything her words did not. Rosa stood from where she had been preparing a batch of fever-reducing tincture. Her hands were shaking. Not from fear, from anger. "I need to speak with the Alpha King. He is in council until midnight at least. Then I will wait." She waited in the corridor outside the council chamber, sat on the stone floor with her back against the wall, and watched the torchlight flicker, and thought about her mother working without rest for 6 weeks while the fever took thousands. Thought about the silver hand and the legacy Isolde had spoken of in the assembly. Thought about what it meant to prove yourself through service when service demanded everything. The council doors opened near midnight. The senior wolves filed out with the exhausted expressions of people who had been arguing for hours and had not reached consensus. Alaric saw her first, raised an eyebrow, said nothing. Cassian was the last to emerge. He saw her immediately. Stopped. "Rosalind," she stood. "I need to go to the borderlands." His face went very still. "No, people are dying. I know. We are managing it. By locking them away and hoping the plague burns out before it takes everyone, it is not that simple. It is exactly that simple." Rosa stepped closer. Her voice was quiet but carried the weight of absolute certainty. "You said I could prove myself through service. Let me serve. Not like this. Not by walking into a plague zone where you could die within a week. My mother did, and she died doing it." The words hung in the air between them. Cassian's expression shifted. Pain moved across his face. "I cannot lose you," he said. The formality was gone. Just truth, raw and undefended. "I have waited 35 years to find someone who sees me instead of the crown. I cannot lose that after 12 weeks. Rosa felt her chest crack open, but she did not step back, did not soften the things she needed to say. "You will not lose me by letting me be who I am, but you might lose me by trying to keep me safe from the things that matter." He closed his eyes, took one breath, then another. When he opened them again, his face had changed. Not to the formal mask he wore in council. To something harder, acceptance and grief wound together. How long will you need? 2 weeks, maybe 3. Conditions. Rosa waited. You take Petra. She knows the borderlands. You take supplies from the court stores, whatever you need. And you send word every 3 days. If I do not hear from you, I am coming after you, and I will burn the entire quarantine to the ground to find you. Agreed. Cassian looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached out and took her hand. The first time he had done so, his fingers were warm, rough from sword work and the thousand small violences of ruling. Come back to me, he said. I will. The borderlands were worse than the reports had suggested. Rosa arrived with Petra and 2 wagons full of supplies to find villages where half the population was already sick. The plague presented as a fever that spiked fast and high, followed by a rash that spread from the chest outward, and then in the worst cases, difficulty breathing. She set up her workstation in the largest village's communal hall, spent the first day simply assessing, learning the progression of the disease, trying to understand what worked and what did not. Isolde would have told her to start with the plants, to look for what grew locally that might have properties to address the symptoms. But Isolde was not there. Rosa had insisted she stay at Silver Peak, maintaining the healing house and training the young women who had been learning the craft. So Rosa looked herself, found yarrow growing wild near the water sources, boneset in the shaded areas, elderflower and hedgerows that had somehow survived the early winter. She made tinctures, poultices, teas that helped with fever and inflammation. Worked 20-hour days and slept in whatever corner she could find when exhaustion finally forced her to stop. Petra worked beside her with steady efficiency, someone who had decided this was her fight too. She organized the healthy villagers into teams, created systems for distributing medicine and monitoring the sick, enforced hygiene protocols with the authority of someone who would not tolerate objections. By the end of the first week, the death rate had slowed. Not stopped, but slowed. And that was enough to give hope, which was its own medicine. Rosa sent word to Cassian on the 3rd day as promised. Brief, factual. We are making progress. More supplies would help. I am well. His response came back the next morning. Supplies are being sent. You had better be well. The second week was harder than the first. The initial wave of patients either recovered or died, and a new wave appeared. Rosa worked until her hands cramped and her vision blurred. Fell asleep standing up more than once, and woke to find Petra guiding her to a cot and forcing food into her hands. On the 10th day, she felt the fever herself. It started as a headache, then the heat building behind her eyes, then the exhaustion that was different from the exhaustion of work. Petra took one look at her and said a word that would have made the court council blush. You are going to rest, Petra said. People need you alive more than they need you dead from martyrdom. Petra's voice had the sharp edge of fear underneath the authority. Sit down, drink this, and if you fight me, I will tie you to that cot myself. Rosa sat, drank the tea Petra had made from her own tinctures, tried not to think about her mother working through fever until her body could not work anymore. The fever climbed through that night and the next day. Rosa drifted in and out of consciousness, heard voices she could not identify, felt cool cloths on her forehead and gentle hands checking her pulse. On the 2nd day of fever, she surfaced enough to understand that someone new was in the room. She opened her eyes. The light was too bright. Everything was too bright. But she could make out the shape of a man sitting beside the cot where she lay. Cassian. He looked terrible. His face was drawn. There were shadows under his eyes like bruises. His hair was disheveled in a way she had never seen. He looked like a man who had been traveling hard and sleeping not at all. You came, she said. Her voice was a whisper. You did not send word on the 13th day. His voice was rough, raw. I told you what would happen if you did not send word. I was sick, I know. I arrived yesterday. You should not be here. The plague can take me or leave me. I do not particularly care which, but I am not leaving without you. Rosa tried to sit up. The world tilted. Cassian's hand was on her shoulder immediately, gentle but firm. Do not, he said. You have been burning with fever for 2 days. Petra says you will recover, but only if you rest. People need help. People are being helped. I brought reinforcements. 3 healers from the Northern Territories and enough supplies to last a month. The village is covered. He paused. You did what you came to do, Rosalind. You slowed the plague. You gave people hope. You saved lives. Now let someone else take the next watch while you recover. She looked at him, really looked, saw past the exhaustion to the fear he was trying to hide, understood that he had dropped everything and ridden for 2 days because the thought of losing her was worse than any political consequence. of abandoning his post. You were supposed to let me prove myself alone, she said. You already proved yourself. His hand found hers, held it carefully as if she were made of something fragile. Now I am proving that I meant what I said in the assembly. That this is not about you serving the court alone, it is about us serving together. Partnership, Rosa said. Partnership, he agreed. She closed her eyes, felt the fever still burning, but also felt something else. Something cooler and stronger underneath it. The relief of not being alone anymore. Thank you for coming, she whispered. Thank you for letting me, he said. The fever broke on the third day. Rosa woke to find the room empty except for Petra, who was dozing in a chair near the window. She sat up slowly. The world stayed stable this time. The headache was gone. The heat had retreated to a manageable warmth. Petra woke immediately, looked at her with an expression that cycled through relief and anger and something that might have been affection. You are the most stubborn woman I have ever met, Petra said, and I have met the Alpha King's mother. Is that a compliment? It is a fact. Petra stood, brought water and bread, and watched with the focused attention of a nurse until Rosa had consumed both. Better much. Good. Because Cassian has been working himself into the ground for 3 days, and if you do not go, tell him you are alive and functional, he is going to collapse from exhaustion and stress. Where is he? Village center. Coordinating the supply distribution. Rosa stood. Her legs were shaky but held. Petra handed her a clean dress and turned away while she changed. They walked together through the village. It looked different from when Rosa had first arrived. Still marked by illness and loss, but also marked by recovery. By the energy of people who have survived something terrible and are beginning to believe they might survive what comes next. She found Cassian in the communal square surrounded by maps and supply lists and 3 wolves who were clearly accustomed to taking orders. He was explaining something about rotation schedules when he looked up and saw her. Everything stopped. He crossed the distance between them in 4 strides, stopped just in front of her with an expression that was trying very hard to maintain composure and not entirely succeeding. You are awake, I am awake. The fever broken. He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, the composure was gone entirely, and what remained was relief so profound it made her chest tighten. Do not ever do that to me again, he said. Get sick, disappear into a plague zone, and nearly die without me. I sent word when I could, I know. I know you did. But when that 13th day came, and there was nothing, he stopped. Started again. I have ruled 12 territories for a decade. I have negotiated peace treaties and put down rebellions and made decisions that sent wolves to their deaths. None of it prepared me for the terror of imagining a world where you did not exist in it. Rosa reached up, touched his face. The first time she had done so, his skin was warm under her palm, rough with several days of beard growth. I am here, she said. I am alive. And we did something good. We did, he agreed. You did. We, she corrected. You brought help. You brought hope. That matters. He turned his head slightly, pressed a kiss to her palm. It was a small gesture, simple, but it felt like a promise. Come back to Silver Peak with me, he said. Let us finish this the right way. The right way, together. They returned to Silver Peak 2 weeks later once Rosa was strong enough to travel and the plague situation had stabilized enough that the reinforcements could manage without her. The court received them with wonder. News had traveled fast. The border healer who had walked into a plague zone and survived, who had slowed the death rate and given hope to people the court had been ready to abandon, who had nearly died and been saved by the Alpha King himself riding to her aid. Except it had not been a rescue. That was the part Rosa made sure everyone understood. It had been a partnership. 2 people choosing to face something difficult together instead of 1 person facing it alone. Octavia was waiting in the courtyard when they arrived. She looked at Rosa with tears in her eyes and pulled her into an embrace that was fierce and genuine. You terrified us, she said, and you made us all ashamed that we were willing to look away. I could not look away, Rosa said simply, not when I had the skills to help. That is what makes you worthy of him. Octavia pulled back, looked at Cassian, looked back at Rosa. That is what makes you worthy of all of this. The bonding ceremony took place 2 weeks later on the first warm evening of early spring. The 3-month trial period had not quite concluded. They were at 14 weeks when the court council convened the day after Rosa's return and voted unanimously that the trial was no longer necessary, that she had proven herself beyond any reasonable doubt. Alpha Ravenscroft had stood and said simply, the healer risked her life for people we were ready to abandon. If that is not service to the kingdom, I do not know what is. And that had been the end of the debate. The ceremony was held in the inner courtyard where Rosa had first met Cassian. The same stone paths, the same fountain now filled with fresh water and early spring flowers. 12-pack representatives attended. Their banners hung from the surrounding walls, moving gently in the evening breeze. Torches lined the courtyard in rows of golden light. But Rosa noticed none of that. She noticed only the dress she wore. The ivory silk with the silver blue embroidery that she had spent 3 weeks making by candlelight in a different life. The dress that had represented hope and transformation and the belief that she could be someone worth choosing. Isolde had helped her prepare, had wept quietly while braiding her hair, had whispered your mother would burst with pride. Octavia had arrived just before the ceremony with a crown of silver wire and early spring flowers, had placed it on Rosa's head and said, "Now you look like a queen." But standing in that courtyard waiting for Cassian to arrive, Rosa felt less like a queen and more like herself, fully, completely, without apology or doubt. Cassian appeared from the northern entrance. He wore black as always, but the fabric was finer than usual. The silver clasp at his throat caught the torchlight and gleamed. He walked across the courtyard to where she stood, stopped in front of her with that expression she had first seen in a corridor 3 months ago. Recognition, certainty, and now something else. Love undisguised and undefended. "Still willing?" he asked quietly. "Always," she said. The ritual words were spoken by the eldest wolf of the council, ancient phrases in a language that felt both foreign and familiar. Words about partnership and service, and the bond between two people choosing each other above all others. Cassian took her hand. She took his. And when the elder declared them bound, when the 12 packs witnessed and approved, when the torches seemed to burn brighter and the very air of Silver Peak seemed to exhale with satisfaction, Cassian leaned down and kissed her. It was not their first kiss. That had happened quietly in the healing garden 2 weeks after her return from the borderlands. But this kiss was different. This one was a promise made in front of everyone who mattered. A declaration that they were choosing this, choosing each other, choosing a future built on partnership and service, and the strength that comes from two people facing the world together. When they finally pulled apart, the courtyard erupted. Alaric was grinning so widely his face looked like it might split. Bastian was wiping his eyes and pretending he was not. Isolde was openly weeping. Octavia was laughing and crying at the same time, and Rosa standing in the dress she had made with her own hands, wearing a crown of flowers and silver wire, holding the hand of a man who saw her for exactly who she was, felt recognition settle deep in her chest. Not completion. She was not someone who needed completing, but recognition. The same recognition she had seen in Cassian's eyes that first night in the corridor. The recognition of someone finding the place they were meant to occupy and understanding that the journey to get there had been necessary. Every step, every heartbreak, every moment of doubt, all of it had led here, to this courtyard, this man, this life she was choosing with clear eyes and a full heart. "Your Majesty," someone called from the crowd, the traditional greeting for a bonded queen. Rosa turned, saw the faces of wolves from 12 territories looking at her with respect and expectation in the beginning of affection. She raised her hand in acknowledgement, and then she said the words that felt most true. "Let us serve well together," and the courtyard roared its approval. 4 years later, Rosalind Devereaux stood in the window seat of the southern tower, one hand resting on her pregnant belly, and watched morning light turn the courtyard silver. The healing house had grown into a network that stretched across all 12 territories. Isolde ran the training program. Petra managed the supplies. And Rosa oversaw it all from the healing garden, where she still spent her mornings. Octavia had married for love a scholar who treated her like a partner rather than a prize. She visited often, bringing her sharp intelligence to whatever problem the court was wrestling with. Cassian appeared in the doorway. He moved quietly still, but Rosa had learned to feel his presence before she heard him. He crossed the room, sat beside her with his hand covering hers on her belly. "Our daughter is active this morning," he said. "She takes after her father. I hope she takes after her mother, strong, unwilling to look away from things that matter." Rosa leaned her head against his shoulder. "Do you ever think about that night?" Cassian asked. "The corridor, the dress. Every day," Rosa said. "It hurt when it happened, but the hurt led me here." She paused. "The dress was never about Dorian. It was about me learning I could transform hope into something real." "You are still doing that," Cassian said. "Every person you heal, every life saved by the network you built." "We built," she corrected. "Yes," he agreed. "We did." They stood together, partners in the truest sense. Two people who had found each other in a cold corridor and chosen to build something that mattered. The ivory dress still hung in the wardrobe, a reminder that worth was not inherited or granted, but proven through what you gave, through what you built with your own hands. And Rosalind Devereaux, who had once been nobody from the border territories, walked the corridors of Silver Peak with her head up and her heart full, and the certainty that she had always been exactly who she needed to be. The dress had never been the transformation. The transformation had been learning that truth, and that she thought was worth every stitch.